First up in the show this week, Linux reached the 3.37% market share according to netmarketshare.com. And before we even get into it, let's go ahead and point out that netmarketshare.com is a very limited amount of data. Over about 40,000 websites use NetMarketShare's analytics over the couple billions that exist. But it is a metric that has been used for a very long time to keep track of how much. So in a sense, it does give you some information about trending. So while it's not that relevant to actual numbers, it is something to watch trends. So that part is interesting to me. So over the course of about a year and a half, or about a year roughly, the percentage has pretty much gone up 300%. So what do you think was the cause of that switch?
I think Linux is just more talked about outside of like your usual geek circles, right? You go to Steam's website and you might see that. I don't know if they still do it, but for a while they were actually recommending that you try Steam on Ubuntu. So I think that's a significant thing. You see the SteamOS logo all the time when you browse Steam. So
Right.
just by Linux getting outside of that usual geek developer circle, it's gaining popularity. I don't know what percentage of it is like users who are going to stick with Linux, but I think a lot of it is people just trying it out, which is the first step. This is how we get hooked.
Then we show them KDE and they stay forever.
And they stay forever, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because there's when this was posted in the r/Linux, there was some people commenting, and it was like a half split between Mac and Windows, and typically it was people just saying that they switched about 6 months to like 9 months ago, and they are now using Linux full time. So it's pretty interesting because like the people who were using Windows typically were referring to the the locking down of everything you're doing and the privacy issues, and the Mac people just weren't really that specific as to why. But and Serge in the chat room said that unfortunately the percentage comes mainly from Apple users, and I asked why it was unfortunate, and he said I would have preferred that it came from Microsoft by and far. And I would say that it would be overall good for the metrics, but I think it's interesting that they're coming from Apple because Apple is kind of considered the safe haven from Windows users who want to leave Windows. So if the thing that's considered the safe haven for some people is losing people as well, that's actually a really good sign in terms of like Linux is doing it better.
It might be to some extent that maybe people are more familiar. The file system structure looks more like what people are used to. They were probably abandoning less applications, moving from Mac to Linux. Aside from your Photoshops and like the professional prosumer type applications for video and graphics editing, you're probably not abandoning. Like if you're a gamer, you're probably not losing any games out of your library by moving from Mac to Linux these days.
That's true. In the chat room, Jules said that they left, I think, Mac because of the new MacBooks were very disappointing, and that's when they switched to Linux. And that's because that's what they did, and then maybe other people are doing it as well. That's an interesting perspective because the new MacBooks are pretty bad, and it also could be an issue of pro users leaving Mac because of the fact that the MacBook Pro, not the MacBook Pro, but the Mac Pro, that trash can was so awful that even Apple came out and admitted that it was awful. Like when Apple has to come out and say it, that's pretty bad.
Yeah, I think a lot of I think the pro Mac users or the quote unquote advanced users are people who are a little bit more willing to learn their OS before they switch to. So I think they're people who can stick on Linux for longer, whereas your average Windows user, first issue they run into that they don't know how to fix, they tend to give up rather easily, I feel.
I figured all of those people would be running on the Hackintosh machines right now.
Well, there are a lot of people who do that, but I don't think it's
Like,
actually.
I mean, like if you
common.
like the workflow of macOS, and you know, how old is the last good Mac Pro? 10 years?
2015. Oh, you mean the actual Pro, not the Mac.
Yeah, like the last Mac Pro that people were happy with.
I think it was about 2008, 2007, somewhere around there.
Yeah. So if you didn't upgrade to the garbage can, then chances are you're running on a Hackintosh. Actually, people probably were running Hackintosh machines just because it took so long for Apple to, you know, release the next generation of Mac Pros.
Yeah, it's really hard for them to iterate on that hardware in that form factor.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the trash can Mac Pro, that was impossible to iterate it because they designed it to be pretty and to have like a style but not be functional. They didn't even consider function. And then when it comes out and people who have spent thousands of dollars on that trash can Mac I don't think anybody actually likes it. I think they've all stated that they absolutely despise it. Like there are some people who do tech reviews and they have one of those and they say it's like a disdain. Like it's just like a thing they have they don't want to get rid of because they spent so much money on it, but it's worthless in their opinion.
Yeah, I actually have one and it's pretty bad. And to the comment in the chat, the price is a driving factor, I think, for a lot of people to leave. The problem, or the trap you run into, is that when your average user who isn't aware of the options in the field goes to Best Buy and looks for the cheapest computer they can find that will still work, they don't see a Linux machine right now. They see, you know, a Windows machine that's $200 that, you know, has a Atom or whatever, barely runs Chrome.
Well, I mean, you can get a pretty decent machine for $250 that runs Linux. That's
exactly, but the problem is we aren't seeing them in stores yet, and I think that will massively drive this adoption percentage up in the future. If we can get, I mean, I think people are increasingly aware of low-end Linux systems, but if we can get stuff that's a reasonable price range and will last people quite a while, I think that's definitely a space that we could see some growth. And I think KDE is actually making some pushes in that space with their laptop, and I want to see.
I would disagree with that.
And I want to see more distros and
more distros on hardware. Yes, I agree with that. But the Slim Book from KDE is expensive.
Yeah, and it's more like a developer.
Yeah, it's more. It's like the Dell XPS competitor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say it's like they're competing on a level that is very niche of a niche. So, good luck with that. I guess that's all I can really say. I mean, I couldn't afford to spend, $1,200 or whatever it is, because I forgot what the transition from euros would be. But it's a significant amount of money for a laptop from a company I've never heard of until they created the KDE Slimbook. Like that's little iffy kind of thing.
The cost, I guess.
Well, it depends on how you look at it.
What do you mean?
I mean, if you run a company and you buy this as your, office computer, this tax write-off, right? A lot of people from their companies, they get, every 2 years they can spend, $1,000 on a device, right? On a new laptop for work. So, and they're allowed to buy whatever they want. They can buy an $800 laptop and pocket $200, or they're allowed to, in some cases, add money to it and buy something better. So, I mean, maybe for the audience that they're targeting with it, it will actually work. But I think the issue here is Can we trust the brand? You know,
Yeah.
I think with that kind of money, like if you know that if you buy a Dell, Dell's going to be around in 2 years if you have an issue, or even in 6 months if you need warranty. But especially with this one, you have to ship it. If you're buying it in the States and there, I believe in Europe, you're shipping your laptop to Europe to get it fixed. That's a problem.
That's true. I would say it's an interesting point about brand, like, I don't know, not necessarily loyalty, but in the sense of like they look at brands being reliable in a sense. But if you look at the idea that Apple has designed obsolescence in their hardware, why are so many people loyal to that brand when they're forced to pay more money for inferior hardware, and at the same time, just a couple years later, their hardware is irrelevant and worthless? Like, they'll even make it where new versions of Mac OS or OS 10 or whatever they're calling it are not supported on that hardware, not for any particular reason. They just don't want to.
Well, I don't think that's a fair point for a couple of reasons. One, Linux distros drop off 32-bit support as well. So in the Linux space, it's not something that's unheard of as well.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like the RAM requirements of the hardware is not able to expand enough to be able to use the minimum requirement of a Mac. It's not necessarily the 32-bit architecture.
They're pretty good about it, though. They go back 8 or 8. What is this? 2017. You can at minimum get the latest OS built on 2010 or 2010 hardware. So, I mean that's not old per se, but
I mean it's interesting. But I've had people.
It's not like a phone that it's every other year.
I've had clients that use Mac and were complaining often about having to buy new Mac machines in order to.
Also, Windows with their new CPU lockdown rolling release, pseudo rolling release, Windows 10 BS is going to have this same problem, and I think it could be yet another reason people continue to turn to Linux, because they're now going to only support, what is it, like 6 CPUs a go at any given time.
Yeah.
And then if you can't update your computer past or to the newest at a given point, based on the arbitrary code execution level, like they literally have a check in the code to see what CPU you have. If it's older than X, then don't run.
That's true.
And as those computers don't get updates anymore, and Windows becomes increasingly spammy about the fact that you're not on the latest hardware, those people could very easily turn to Linux, continuing to drive up our market share, and Linux will take over the world.
If only. Well, not if only, but I hope so someday.
When,
well, I mean, as far as desktop related stuff, as far as everything else, we already own that. But the desktop related stuff, like that's the last hurdle for domination. But in the chat room, Serge said another reason might be the fact that they're very good laptops from System 76, Introware, Slimbook, Station X, and etc., which are better than the Apple equivalents for roughly the same price or in the same price range. And that might be a case because there is something to say about the Dell machines as well as those, where you have these price ranges that are roughly about the same as Macs, but they offer the similar support, or they have like higher quality hardware in their machines as far as like more powerful but still cheaper. That might be a reason why people look at it and go, well, if I'm going to spend the same amount of money, I can get better hardware and get more hands-on support. So that could be another reason why the Mac users are more likely to switch over. But there are options of like buying the hardware for yourself from Clevo. Well, not really necessarily Clevo, because you can't buy from Clevo, but you can buy like from outlets that sell Clevo stuff. But I'd say that that's a different approach, because while you could do that and save some money, you're not going to get any of the support. You're not going to get any custom firmware stuff or any of the custom driver built. Like System 76 builds a lot of their own custom stuff, which we could just completely ignore the Pop! OS part. But they do make some improvements to kernel stuff sometimes, and some display server fixes and things like that. So overall, they do provide something more than just a rebranding. Rose said in the chat room that Apple's always been lower specs in hardware for a long time versus other brands, and that's true. So it might not be that much of a difference. But
well, is it though? Because now that they ship with, now it's been forever that they've been doing that. Now they ship with just Intel stuff. It's the same thing. It's just more.
No, it's because it's like an older generation, or they'll provide a i3 for the price of an i7 when you get a PC version.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, so,
it's also based on their hardware iteration cycles, though. They only refresh every so often. So if you buy something 2 years after the release of, say, a trash can, they haven't changed the hardware. They're still buying that exact same hardware.
Right, because they can't change it.
Yeah, everyone else. Well, I don't even think that it's that they can't. It's that they don't see the market need to. When they're making, billions of dollars a year, they don't care.
When it comes to trash can, they actually physically can't because they weren't taking into consideration the changes of sizes needed for the different different graphics drivers and stuff.
Yeah.
The other ones, it is
would need
probably
to
because
come out with another form factor, but they should have done it, right? They should have gone year 2, and they would look at their lineup, or companies these size, OEM partners of Intel or of AMD, get advance notice about new architectures, things coming down the pipes. You work with them to release new hardware in synchronization with the release of new Intel processors or of new, anything.
That's true.
The fact that they're not doing that is only because they don't think that it will affect their bottom line.
Well, they in the sense of the trash can, they screwed up heavily, and they did come out and admit that they screwed up. But for a long time, they never wanted to admit that they messed up.
Yeah, that was too little, too late. I know plenty of people who are design-ish people who are moving to Windows and getting dual socket Xeon motherboards.
Yeah,
because Intel's not or Apple's not keeping up, and they realize for the same $5,000 price that I bought this super high-end trash can, I could buy a extremely twice the power in almost a server grade editing rig.
Yeah, that's true. WWNSX in the chat room said that he says that he suspects that the next major Mac hardware revision will be 2019. And that's actually very likely because there was an announcement about the trash can that they're supposedly doing it in 2019. But that's kind of funny that they admitted that the machine they made was terrible, but they're not going to replace it for a couple years, which is very unlike Apple. They usually announce stuff and it's ready the next month or something. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as far as that could be another factor where they're confusing people or making people not so. Not really trusting them and their decisions, making them leave and go to Linux or something else.
There's a comment in the chat about 32-bit browsers, and most open source browsers will have builds for that. Chromium and Firefox, as far as I'm aware, both have 32-bit builds.
I think Chromium has abandoned 32. Firefox still has it.
Firefox still has it for sure. I'm looking at it in the AUR here.
Yeah, Firefox definitely does have it, but I think Chromium did. At least they abandoned it on Linux. They might have abandoned it entirely. I'm not sure, but they did abandon it on Linux for sure.
No, there's a Chromium build for 32-bit.
Well, in the Arch repos, I'm talking about if you go to the Chromium website or the Google Chrome. Perhaps the Google Chrome is the one that's been officially abandoned, whereas the Chromium is still being compiled separately. Yeah, that's possible.
In any case, people shouldn't be using Windows XP. If you see one, unplug it for them.
Unplug it for them. Hand them the USB drive that has Linux on it. That's a good option because they should not be using XP for sure. And people should stop using 32-bit as soon as possible, please. It is needs to go away. If you
already walk around with a USB stick with your favorite distro on it, then you need to get on that ASAP.
Yeah. You need to fix that immediately. And perhaps to make up for your prior mistake, have 2 just in case.
Just as penance.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible as this old hardware, especially in third world countries, is kind of dying out and, just either stops working or just it works way too slow to do anything? Do you think it's possible that that Marketshare for inexpensive devices, they're primarily web browsers will go to cheap ARM devices instead of
Yeah,
to 30-bit.
that is definitely possible.
Hopefully, ARM dies in fire.
That's probably not going to
What?
happen.
Why not? It should happen. With how low power Intel is making their x86 processors now, I don't think there's really any need for it. A few years ago, yes, but Intel has reacted fairly well to that change in market and has been.
ARM has a nice instruction set, and also I fried my Intel Edison this week, so ARM is better.
ARM also has an issue of having different hardware compatibility, just having a different device. Like if you have the same, you can have the exact same ARM processor, but because of the way the structure of ARM works, that might not work on the other device that you build for one specifically. So you have to build for like a framework that sits on top of ARM in order to have any kind of universal features. Which that's one of the reasons why ARM is bad. Like it's very low resources, it's very low power. That's awesome. It's very restrictive just inherently. And that's not very awesome. But in the chat room, Rose said most web browsers are abandoning 32-bit, and Windows XP has a larger market share than Linux, and that's potentially true still, mainly because of the continued support for enterprise and I think accessibility stuff. I know definitely enterprise stuff, but that is a horrible situation, and that's absolutely Microsoft's fault for making terrible systems.
Well, and I think she or whoever Rose is potentially saying though that just giving them a browser, a more secure browser, will make it okay to continue to use these systems, and that's not the case.
Right. Well, they're going to continue to use it, but it's also they're not going to be able to in a couple of years. Like they're going to lose 100% support pretty soon. But it's also in a way it's Microsoft's fault. Not necessarily because people use XP, it's because every other version of Microsoft, that's every version that Microsoft releases of Windows is awful. Like they make one that's like complete garbage followed by an improved version of that garbage. Like I think you can like every single other example, like Windows 3.1, pretty garbage. 95, good version of that garbage. Like they've replaced all the things, changed the trend, the interface. Overall was good. 98 garbage, 98 SE good, ME garbage, XP good. You know, and you can just continue the entire time. It's always good crap, good crap, good crap.
Well, let's also keep in mind that XP was horrible until the Service Pack came out.
That's true. Service Pack 1 basically improved it to the point where, but you could say that to, I guess, every version. Like until the service packs, might as well not even use it.
Like literally, people remember XP so fondly because by the time it really took off, it was with Service Pack 2, which made it a really stable operating system. Without Service Packs, XP was buggy. It was on some hardware that it listed as supported. It wouldn't work at all. It was a horrible, horrible experience. And the predecessor to that was ME, which was awful. 2000, which
basically the
I
same.
think still didn't know whether it wants to be a server or a desktop operating system. Or the last good one was 98, which was very aged at that point. So, and that's not 98 basic either. It was 98 second edition at that point. So like when XP first came out, things weren't as peachy as some people remember them being.
That's true. I think that's true about every release they make. But Serge said in the chat room that back to the 32-bit part that Firefox has announced they will be abandoning 32-bit support, and in my opinion, that's actually kind of a good thing because 32-bit means your hardware is at least 12 years old. And more than likely about 15 years old, maybe even older. Because it was like 2003 when they started doing like full blown, like this is going to become the standard, and I think it was 2005 when it became the standard. So you got about a 12-year era where your computers are just super old, and people should like in computers 5 years is pretty old, and 7 years is kind of like on the verge of just replace it. It's terrible. When you go beyond that, you're like 10, 12 years old. You're talking about like ancient hardware that is surprising that it even functions, much less usable.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said though for if it works, keep using it. And I think there will be niche distros that continue to build for and support 32-bit. I don't think that'll actually be a problem, just because there is demand for it. I think the problem you're going to run into is even the developers of the aforementioned distro will eventually have their hardware die or lose interest or upgrade their hardware, so you won't have developers for it anymore. But for the time being, there's a fairly large market share that requests that.
I mean, there are people who still request it, but it's something like I don't like the idea that people insist on saying Linux is good because of old hardware and it can bring new life to old hardware. I think that Linux is better with newer hardware, and it's good for so many reasons. And this is an issue of just perpetuating a problem that of essentially you're telling people to switch over really old hardware instead of getting new hardware, because they could get new hardware that's cheaper and still use Linux. But if you say someone already has
hardware and use Windows too, though,
right? But
this is that they don't want to spend the money or can't spend.
It depends on the hardware. If the hardware is 10 years old, they should just spend the money. Like
why? It still works.
Just don't buy anything too new, but because then you might get issues with Linux too.
All right.
Hey Joe. Hey Liberty. Joining us.
So, yeah, Liberty Paul, thanks for joining. You're late to the party, and so are we. So it's all right. You've only missed one topic. But moving on to the next topic is the poll that DistroWatch made regarding Flatpaks and snaps, showing that this was released this week from a poll they conducted last week on their site. And if you look at the results, it says that a total of roughly about 1,437 people used. That's not roughly, that's an exact, but still, 1,437 people took this poll. Very small percentage said they used Flatpak. Very small percentage said they used snaps, and a high significant percentage said they were using nothing. None of those two. So, what is your opinions on that topic?
I think I'm interested in what people consider as use, because I have used Flatpaks, I have used the snaps, but would I consider myself a Flatpak or a snap user? Probably not. I use apt and dept packages, right? So.
But do you use them in general? Like, do you use either?
I have used them. I don't actively pick snap packages over dev packages. I don't use snap to search for packages before I use apt.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the main of it, is that it's not the default for what most people are using as their package managers, and in some cases it's not even built in to Synaptics or whatever other package manager you're using. If it's not the default, people won't use it. They're just going to search for X application. If it installs, they're good. If it was only available via snaps, then people would be forced to turn to it. But right now, it's not the default. There's no.
Well, there are things that are only available as a snap.
Well, then I don't install them.
Well, you also don't. You also don't think about snaps. And that's a good point, that people don't often think about snaps, and they might not even search for them at all. They might just,
we just need to update the UIs of our package managers for people who are still using graphical package managers.
Well, that depends on the distro to update it. For example, like Arch doesn't have a graphical user interface for Pacman, whereas
No,
you
but
could get
there's
like
a lot
Pamac
of
or
noise.
something like that. But they have to integrate snaps. But they have to have
Right.
they'd have to know that the distro that you're using it has integrated snaps in order to integrate snaps in those apps. So that makes it
I think
a little complicated.
we might see something in the future where there's some tool that merges together apt and snap, where you
Yeah.
just search for a package and it searches, one or the other first. If it can't find it in one, it searches the other and tells you, hey, I couldn't find this package in your default, package manager, but it's available in this one. Would you like to install it? And this is how I would. That's what would get me to start using Snap packages, because I'm looking to go through the effort of installing something if I can find it. I don't even have the habit developed that there might be a Snap package out there that I should look for it. If I don't see the package, I pull sources and I compile stuff. So just merge, build some kind of a tool, and that does automatically.
Well, Ubuntu software.
So I don't have to think of it.
If you use Ubuntu or anything based on Ubuntu, you can use Ubuntu software that does have snaps built into it that you don't have to think about it.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is Ubuntu users are Snap users, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, and also Solus users are Snap users, whether they like it or not. Like they could install software from their software center with snaps, and it'll work just as good as it will in Ubuntu. Because Ike set up Solus, that one of the new releases of Solus, one of the biggest features of the newest release, and was to include full support at the same level that Ubuntu does of Snappy. So it's not even just we have Snapd; it's we have everything that makes the Snap ecosystem work and perfectly install. Like it's like they're the first distro to have that level of integration.
Do they host their own server infrastructure for that?
No, not Snaps. No,
they're still using Ubuntu's.
They use yes, because there's no reason to do that. There's no reason to switch it.
So that's actually a problem for me. I don't really like that. I like things being distributed, and that's one of the reasons I kind of prefer Flatpak over Snap. There are a lot of negatives to that, right? That you have a million websites potentially you're trying to hit to install random Flatpaks, which I really don't like the design of. I do and prefer it to be centralized, but I want it to be centralized per distro, not every distro relying on Ubuntu.
Well, that's not centralized then. That's the opposite of centralized. That's fragmented. If you have an application format that you create and your goal is to make it universal, and the access to get those things are not universal, you've already broken a big aspect of what makes it universal.
You need to make the server side easy to host. And
it is. You can absolutely do it yourself
and not rely on Ubuntu.
I'd completely disagree. The idea that that Canonical should make it possible for it to host your own, I agree with that. Which they did, which is cool, and that's fine. And if someone wants to, they can. But the benefit of using snaps is that you don't have to host your own, and you don't have to try to convince that the people that your snaps are better. Or when someone says, "Oh, you support snaps, why can't I search for this particular snap in your software center?" Well, I don't have support for that particular one because I haven't put it in my repo. Whereas they could just use the universal one that Canonical provides. That they can. Like the benefits of snaps are more than just the format itself. Yes, you could just download a snap and install it anytime that any distro uses a Snapd or whatever. That's great. But you can also have the benefit of getting updates incredibly quick with the distributed version that Canonical provides, because Launchpad is what creates these snaps. The Snapcraft is the global framework of building them, and they're super easy to build. And what's really cool is you set up your code to recognize and build snaps automatically. You can put your code into GitHub. You can have a folder specifically for all the stuff that snaps are in your source, and you can tell Launchpad to use your GitHub. And then anytime you ever make a change, it will automatically make a new snap and update your snap. You don't have to submit anything. It just does it. So you make a new commit, it goes, okay, cool, we'll compile it for you, done.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. So like when you have a different,
could do that though, right? If
they'd have to also have their own
Launchpad?
Launchpad. And yes, Launchpad is also open source, but in order to have all of these things set up, it's just not worth it for a lot of distros. They have to create a bigger infrastructure to support it, which makes it even less likely for people to implement it in their distro. Whereas if you use the base system of the Snap system with Canonical and Launchpad and everything, you get all the benefits of these snaps, and you also get the infrastructure of the snaps, and you can get more people convinced to use snaps, which means more developers are wanting to use snaps. And you can look at like uappexplorer.com, which is if you go to search snap find and try to find what's in there, you can't really see what's all in snaps because they don't have a good way to do that yet. But uappexplorer.com is a website that has track of all the snaps that are available. And you can see there's a ridiculous amount, like a very surprising amount, are actually in there. So snaps are very popular in the sense of like getting new people to come in and convincing companies to say, oh, well, you've made this so much easier for me, I can make a snap for it. And there are a lot of developers, open source developers, companies that will say, well, we're also going to make a snap for that release as well because it's super easy. We just say, hey, GitHub, look to Launchpad, make a snap for us. And that's it. Like all they have to do is fill out a config file, which is a basic, you have to understand the way the structure of the config file is. But once you do, it takes very little effort. It's just a few text, a few lines. It's probably like you can set up a snap with probably less than 20 lines, 30 lines, something like that, and have it automatically build just when you make an update. That's an amazing option for developers. And I think that's one of the reasons why Snaps is so interesting and is so, I don't know, so has so much potential to change the market share of Linux as well, because it itself can bring in new people, new developers. And one of the reasons why you don't get users is you need to have developers to want to do it. And I think that it's an unfortunate thing that people don't put more interest into like checking out snaps and trying them out, because there are some aspects of it too that I don't really like, but there are so many good things about snaps that are just fantastic. I made a video about snaps and Snappy about a year ago, actually. That's still very relevant, and it still explains the core fundamentals of Snappy. But there's so many things that have changed now, like the whole automatic Launchpad building. That's pretty new. But there are so many things that are just fantastic. And the Snap runtimes, well, more like frameworks, but basically the same thing. So really the only thing that Flatpaks do that are different is distributed sources by default, which if you've used Flatpaks, you will probably hate. Like I hate it because I've used Flatpaks in multiple cases, and having to figure out which repo your Flatpak is in is just so annoying. And then the community comes out and makes FlatHub, which is a centralized source for Flatpaks. So most people are now using FlatHub in order to get Flatpaks because centralized is better. In this particular situation, it's better.
Right, and I don't actually disagree that it's not easier. I just don't like the idea of other distros relying on Ubuntu for anything.
Well, so I think maybe
they already do.
Open build service needs to be like a liaison for storing and building that stuff, because nobody has strong feelings one way or the other towards SUSE.
Yeah.
I mean, we discussed that last week, so it totally is. That is an interesting situation where you could have said the same thing. If people had just used the open build service years ago, the same problem we have now would have been gone already, because they build debs, they build RPMs, they build target
but
EXEs.
You still need separate configs for every package, right? Which if I only use
create a new spec
I'm not
file.
going to build. I'm not going to build a new spec. I won't even be able to test it if I only use Ubuntu and I want OBS to build a package for me a dev package, I won't even be able to test if I even write a config file or a build file, whatever, for Fedora. I can't even test it.
Well, that's true. You got to change the specs files for each one, but once you build that spec for each one, it's pretty seamless. But here's another thing. One of the things I want to talk about this particular poll that DistroWatch made was two factors why I don't think this poll is really that important. But it got a lot of attention this week.
It's on DistroWatch.
That's one. But there's in like the subreddit for R Linux, there was a lot of people talking about this, like hundreds of people voting on this and saying that it was good to have information. And I think that this poll is flawed from the start, but for multiple reasons. One, a lot of people, like you could look at people in the comments on the R Linux saying they weren't even aware that DistroWatch had polls, but they do these polls every week, and a lot of people not even aware of that. And also, when I was writing my comment to respond to someone who said that, there was 1,490 people on the subreddit at that particular time. There are 1,437 people who took this poll. So that is a huge discrepancy of how many people actually saw this to see how many people got the response. And now in the chat room, some people mentioned app image, which is a very important thing to discuss because this poll does not mention app images. And if you look in the comments on the poll, there are people who actually said app images, like I chose neither because I use app images. So they do actually use a universal package format. They just don't use one of those two. And I'm a person who also uses app images. I use snaps as well and I use all three really, but because I want to test them all and like find out how they all work. So mainly so I can make videos about it. But app images are fantastic, and I use them all the time.
I would say out of the three, I've used app images the most because of Etcher.
Because of what?
Because of Etcher.
Etcher, yeah, absolutely. Etcher is fantastic. There's so many reasons to use app images, and Etcher is one of them. Krita also has an app image. Kden Live has an app image. Like there are so many applications that are super useful that provide app images that at the moment right now, I would say popularity-wise, app images and snaps are on par. I think snaps are fundamentally better and have higher potential to go farther and provide a better market for developers, but app images right now have so many more benefits in general, like as the current usage. Whereas Flatpaks are like, I think either way they're not good. They're not popular now. They're not, and their potential in the future is not as high as snaps. So in the sense of Flatpaks, I understand why people don't use them. And there's only probably about 20 Flatpaks that even exist. Like you go on the Flatpak website and you say the list of applications, most of which are not even there, and they don't even link to where you get them. So you have to just hope you find it. Whereas there's some examples where you can go to like FlatHub and you can find applications there, but to find them on the website, it's really not intuitive. So it makes it another bigger impact of making it confusing for people to use those packages. And snaps are a little easier because you have Ubuntu software and you have Solus Software Center and you have all these things that are trying to make, or UApp Explorer that are trying to make snaps easier. But overall, you have an app image system that's already available that provides great features and, more importantly, is working on integrating like a bigger ecosystem like OBS, the Open Build Service from OpenSUSE, actually has support now to build app images. So maybe you don't want to do OBS to do all the different packages, but you could use it to just automatically build app images for you. So that could be a huge thing for developers as well. So overall, I think these universal app formats are something that should have existed 20 years ago, but Unfortunately, they were not possible at the time. Now that they are possible, we should stop trying to like attack them and saying they're not relevant. We should be spending more time advocating for why we should use them. And Farron, yes, OBS is multiple things. And while I'm talking about Open Build Service, I am using Open Broadcaster software.
Well, you know what? I think app images right now, I wouldn't be surprised if app image is the most popular because you don't have to think about using it. You just, download this file and just, click on it. Everything's good, right?
You got to make it
no
right executable, but yeah.
There's no tutorial for using app images, right? Whereas even with how easy Snap packages are to use in Ubuntu right now, if you're using a derivative that doesn't have browser configured, so you can click install on UApp Explorer and just install apps. Then you have to Google how to solve this, how to get how to do it in the terminal or how to get the browser to understand what Snap means. So I think app images could be winning right now just because of the simplicity. Like there's nothing to it.
Yeah, the only as far as using it, the only thing you have to do is to right click and change permissions, and you say this is executable, use it, and it's kind of a barrier, but it's not a barrier that's really that hard because you can just you go on the front page of app images and it explains like it's a little GIF that explains how to do it. It's like super easy. You just right click, properties, permissions, execute, double click, and that's it. Pretty simple.
See, everything in my download folder just inherits executable permissions.
Well, that's an interesting way to go about it. That that would work. That would make it much easier.
It would technically work, but your system might not work for a very long time.
In the chat room, Rose is asking what package format is the best for a developer, and I would say that's a hard thing to answer, mainly because right now snaps and app images are on par with ease of use as far as ease of building the package. There are some discrepancies between the two, such as it's harder to know where to find snaps. It's like there's also different branches of snaps. Like there's the edge case. Like for example, KDE's Falcon browser, which is the rename from Cupzilla, is now a snap, which is only available right now with the -- edge parameter on the command when you install it, because it's in the like not experimental. It's not really experimental. It's just in a brand new version, so the snaps are only available when you put that tag in there. Whereas if they made an app image, you could just download the app image and run it. So like there's different levels of what makes it benefit. But there's also in snaps there's sandboxing, and there's like jailing the container of the content, where you're still saving stuff in your home folder, but the actual the code of the program is locked into its container. It's not really a container, but it kind of is. Like it's a little bit more involved, but essentially it's just call it a container, and it's locked in there. So you can have multiple versions of the same snap because of that containment. But at the same time, it also creates an integration with the core system. So like all your home folder can go on there, and like you can .local and .config and stuff like that. So overall, it provides a feature that app images doesn't have. It doesn't have any confinement at all, and it doesn't really have much security concepts built into it. You can use FireGel to launch an app images and kind of create a sandbox environment, sort of, but by default, app images don't have it. So like either way, you're looking at a situation where there are some pros and cons to both. And as far as Flatpak goes, I would probably go with that's the worst option for a developer, because you're looking at a situation where you might even have to provide your own repo in order to provide it to people, which defeats one of the main benefits that people want to use Universal Apps for to develop, which is I make this app, I put it on where people expect to find it, and they use it. So Flatpaks are interesting. And another thing about it is Solus originally, when Ike was looking at which one to integrate with, he looked at both Flatpaks and Snaps, decided Flatpak was better functionally, is more like a philosophical approach with the whole distribution system, and now has changed his mind completely. While he's still doing support with Flatpaks, he's now not anti-Snaps and is completely integrated Snaps in every way through the system. So like that is a good example of where, you know, seeing how Snaps are so important and so useful. In the chat room, Gampa Gamer, I think that's how he said it, is asking if app images are sort of like Windows executables, in the sense that you download it and install it. And the answer is yes and no. You download it and run it. You don't have to install it at all. So there are certain things about app images that are good, and there's some things that are bad. So like there is some security features in general. Like if you download a dev file and you install it, you're gonna have to run sudo, and you're trusting it automatically, right? So there is some security issues there. There's no confinement. There's nothing they're doing. The dev file is doing anything at all to ensure security. You just have to trust it and make sure you're getting your dev from a place that you trust. Whereas an app image doesn't have to run sudo at any point. So it's not putting anything into your system folders because it doesn't need sudo to run, because it's not going to install anything. It's just going to run on your system. So you have the benefit of not needing to use sudo so it's not going to break your system, but it doesn't have confinement, and like the multiple levels of why, like, you know, pros and cons for all of them. But the app images and the Snaps approach, I think, are the best. App images are the best right now. Snaps are the best in the future. If, like, my ideal situation is Snaps and app images kind of work together and create a Snap images. So I kind of regret that joke.
Well,
but.
I think it's a kind of philosophical difference between app images and snap packages, because app images are supposed to work everywhere because of how simple they are, right? And snap packages are kind of have a ton of features, and they are supposed to work on like the way containment works. I think it's kind of, it's pretty obvious that it's a poke at IoT, because for security there, people want containment. So it's not only covering the use cases on the desktop, but also on maybe like wearable or devices or home automation devices, and it's all covering snap packages cover all of it. So from a perspective of the developer, like, it depends on what you're doing. Like, do you have a simple application that I don't know, like a text editor that you want to make it as easily accessible and distro agnostic for people to install? App image is probably a good solution for you. If you are dealing with some complex application and you want to not only have the ability to install on a lot of operating systems, but also like a lot of platforms, snap packages would probably be the better options, because I can see Ubuntu Core get somewhere and actually be installed on some interesting devices in the future, by default even.
I mean, that's true. I guess you could use like app images as like a kiosk mode sort of too, so that you can replace them pretty easily as well. There are some other negatives as far as, like, app images don't have that good of an update mechanism. Like they do have an update mechanism, but it's not as seamless as like, you know, apps updates, or Snap has the same basic function that apps do, that app update us. It's like Snap update, really. That's really cool. App images don't have that to that degree. But overall,
but that's that's the difference in what kind of application you're using, right? Because if you build a text editor, going back to that example, and you release a new version with some cool features, and you announce this cool feature, people will want to do the update, even if it's manual, to get that cool feature. If you if you're distributing some boring application that most people don't care about, like, I don't know, OpenSSH, and you release a security update, well, it's important that users get it, but not all users might care enough to get it, right?
right.
OpenSSH is in Linux in Ubuntu by default, I mean, and it's important that it stays up to date for security reasons. But let's face it, most desktop Ubuntu users probably don't care about what version of OpenSSH they're running. So it's important that there is an update mechanism that's seamless, that keeps their systems secure for them.
There was a security update this week for OpenSSH specifically, actually, and how many people are aware of that? Like, not many at all.
I'm not.
Right? There you go. There you go. And why would you need to know it? Like, I didn't even include it in the show, the recorded show, because it's not something a lot of people want to know. It's interesting, and people should update, but in an ideal world, those things would be updated automatically in the back end, and you wouldn't have to think about it. So I don't know, and it actually is a good. In a way, you could say that these formats are bringing a separation of fundamental packages and applications that people want to use now, which that can bring a benefit as well. So like if you have a Snap application or an app image application that you want to use, you can just use that, and you don't have to worry about, when you run apt update, is it going, or apt upgrade, really specifically, apt upgrade, if you're going to get an update for an application that you're currently running and you do have to reboot that application or whatever, you don't have to worry about that. It's just, you could just run it in the background and not even think about it, because it'd be separated in that way. So that would be a pretty cool solution. A perspective of why these formats are even better is, prior to this, run it everywhere kind of thing. Because there's multiple factors where these formats are very important. And we haven't even touched on the fact that a lot of people who are anti these formats are like promoters of debs and RPMs, and other formats like EOPKG or tar.exe or whatever. But they're ignoring the fact that all of those are terrible. For the fundamental reality of Linux ecosystem, they're all awful in the sense of usability and upgrades and compatibility. And like, for example, when someone says, debs are better than RPMs, you can argue that debs are better than RPMs, but you could say debs are better or RPMs are better than a universal format. They're wrong, just completely straight out wrong, because the fact that you can have a deb file that is made for Debian that doesn't work on Ubuntu or Mint or Elementary OS or whatever, but you can also have, and then they sometimes do, and you can have Ubuntu packages that don't work on Debian or Elementary or whatever, based on just versions. That's it. Nothing else. I have a package that's made for 1604, but someone's using 1704 and they can't have it. Why? Well, because that's how it is. Or there's a namespace inside of the deb for Ubuntu that's wrong for Debian. So like, for example, FileZilla. FileZilla is completely compatible in both Debian and Ubuntu, but the namespace for a particular dependency in Ubuntu is different than in Debian. So when you try to install the latest version of FileZilla in Debian from a PPA, for example, it will not work, because that's the wrong file name or the wrong package name. If you extract the deb file, change the name, repackage that deb file, then run it in Debian, it'll work fine. and these are just multiple levels of where these particular formats are just not good for mass adoption. So the universal format, while some people might not like it, it's an absolute necessity.
I think the format that wins is obviously the one that is going to get picked for a Linux standard base. That's what everybody is going to use after, right?
Not necessarily, because the base itself, I mean, app images are not meant to be used as a core, like as the core system. And snaps have
the sarcasm just flew right over your head.
I did not notice any sarcasm, no, at all.
Well, I thought it was pretty obvious because nobody's like
I think it's pretty high.
Using RPMs.
What are you talking about? OpenSUSE, Fedora, Red Hat, CentOS?
Nobody uses those distros.
Nobody, of course not. Gecko Linux also. But there's PC Linux OS, which uses RPMs inside of apt for some reason. Overall, these formats are good, and there's so much negative press towards them that it's kind of funny. The best negative press I've seen is when people are attacking Canonical for making snaps, because why are you we already had Flatpaks, everybody's already pushing the Flatpaks, and the community is. And there's actually a post that someone submitted a bug to Snapcraft saying that this is a non-invented here syndrome, and snaps are just like an anti-Flatpak approach and blah blah. But what's hilarious is that person has no idea any information about the systems of the formats themselves. For one, the biggest reason that person is completely wrong is snaps were created before Flatpaks, so the non-invented here syndrome would be Flatpaks. So it's kind of Mageia, OpenMandriva, Cora. Those are other examples. Yeah, thanks, Serge. So there's this. Snaps are good. Give it a chance, is what I say. Just give it a chance. And also, app images are just as good at the moment, so give those a chance too. I suppose we should move on from that topic. So last week we talked about Electron and whether they're good to have or not, and depending on what you're providing as the application for Electron. So this week I wanted to talk about an application that could be pretty interesting for Electron usage. And this is kind of an example where Electron is a good option because it's already a web app that you're trying to manipulate. And this is called Tusk. It's an application that sits on top of Evernote and improves it and gives you more like desktop features. The most obvious one is the dark thing that you can see in the screenshot of the video right now. But it also adds integration with notifications, like app indicator support, keyboard shortcuts, and many things that are just fundamental desktop improvements. So overall, I think this is a very good example of where Electron is usable and does provide benefits, where you can take an existing web app and kind of repackage it to be a better experience on the desktop.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is this developed by Evernote, or is this another?
It's an unofficial third-party thing.
Gotcha.
All the stuff you say
potentially could break.
It could break
very easily.
It is possible that it wouldn't in the future. A next release from Evernote, it could break something. Yes.
Yeah, I hope though that the companies who make web apps like this can look at the fact that there is a desire for people to run things like this locally on their machines, and they've created plugins for other systems. But Electron is a really good option, and hopefully more, not just Evernote, but other popular web apps start creating.
I think their logic is just, you want to run locally, just use a browser.
Yeah, I know. That's obviously not the mindset most people have when using products like this, and that there is a desire to run it using the full desktop features. So the fact that people cared enough to go out and create their own project around this shows that there are users, there's a desire for it.
I would agree with that. But as far as like Evernote is kind of like a juggernaut in this space of like memo taking and note taking and stuff like that. So it kind of makes sense that someone would want to do something like this. And and there's been other examples like I think Nick's Note was based on it, and there was like not Everpad. It was something like that. That's like something remote, like somewhere around the same line as Evernote, but not the same name. But it was kind of doing the same thing, where they were taking Evernote and making it a little bit better. In this case, I think it's doing it in a better approach, where you're creating like a package that you can build upon. And another thing is, like, if you like using the Evernote system and you already do use the Evernote system, for example, you can have everything you already had is going to be available in Tusk because it uses the backend of Evernote anyway. So it's just like sitting on top and improving it. And I think that's a good example of where Electron is powerful.
I can think of a ton of services that I would really love Electron Apps for. For example, I use a tasks within Nextcloud.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to have local integration of that and have a keyboard shortcut that would allow me to add tasks very easily instead of having to go through all this web interface and constantly have yet another tab open all the time to manage that kind of stuff. Native notifications. I mean, browser notifications are getting better, but
yeah, they are. But it's when they're putting in the direct feature, specifically for it. You don't have to rely on like maybe the browser will detect it or maybe not. You can guarantee it will if you have an Electron app because it's looking for it specifically, and that is a good point. There are things that I wish were available as Electron apps as well that would be more beneficial, like Gmail or something like that would be nice. There are stuff that are trying to approach that, and I'm making a video about one of them, so we'll see if people are interested in that. But like overall, Electron has a lot of potential, and unfortunately, it also has a lot of weird stuff that happens with it too, because it's so easy to make something. You can, like in this example, this is an example of where I don't really understand why it exists. It's called Upterm. It is a terminal application based on Electron. And it also has some extra features that are kind of interesting with like IDE tools. So like syntax highlighting and things and autocomplete, stuff like that. That's kind of cool overall, but it's still a terminal built in Electron. And I'm not really picking on Upterm specifically because there are other ones like Hyper and some other ones that are terminal or Electrons specifically made for terminal emulation. And that seems a little bit excessive.
Oh, you got to deal with your most important applications first.
I suppose you may have a point there.
How many terminal windows do you have it open right now? I have at least 4 or 5. So,
0.
Well,
drop down, you quake.
I have that one too, right? So I should add, +1, n+1.
So yeah, I don't have any terminal windows open because it's in quake. It's drop down, so it's like it's always there. It's always waiting for me, and it takes up 20 megs, RAM. Not 200.
Exactly. If you have an unlimited amount of RAM, guess how many tabs you could open with this thing? It'd be awesome. I'm obviously being facetious. I don't think it's necessary to have a terminal like this, but it's good that more people are doing it, I guess.
Yeah, that's true.
I have no use for it personally.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is in a way. There are some benefits. I don't know, because if it's only for Linux or Mac, maybe because it uses the same kind of terminal approach, it wouldn't seem to be that useful. Because like one of the biggest benefits of Electron is that you can use Electron apps on cross-platform. But if it's something like this, like there's not much need for the cross-platform aspect. I don't know. Like it just seems like a non-important issue, but it is a very controversial issue as well. Whether people should use stuff at Electron or not.
Well, when am I going to get my Tux Digital Electron app so that I don't have to go to YouTube? I can just
Next
open it up
week.
and immediately get your videos.
Next week, absolutely. I mean, not at all, but maybe.
We need to get on that ASAP.
You could go to getfranz, franz.com, and then add the Tux Digital page as one of the entries for that, or Rambox. You could also do that. You can have your very own Tux Digital saved Electron app through those. So I provided you a solution. You're welcome.
Does it have keyboard shortcut support?
Yes.
Does Alt
Not
F4 work?
super integrated, no. I think it has a little bit. But that's, I think, well, we could have one more conversation if you want. Otherwise, we're kind of running over a little as far as time goes. So I was thinking maybe you could have a conversation about the usage of Discord in this show and whether you are, whether I'm just curious about the community. If you do, listen to the show, and if you are interested in using the show, but Discord keeps you out or something like that, I just, just wondering what the feedback kind of thing. Obviously, that particular question doesn't apply to the people here now, but potentially it might be an issue for some, and I'm just curious if there is one.
Yeah. Or if you have Discord, why are you not in the room?
That's a good question too. If you already have a Discord server, why are you not in here? That is also a good one. So I guess that's it for the show today, or this week. Come back next week for another riveting episode of This Week in Linux. And
In rice?
And rice, potentially. If you catch the pre-show, there may be some rice discussion, like there was this week. But thanks for coming to the show, and we're going to keep streaming a little bit longer. At least I will be. And so if you want to still keep a conversation going, absolutely, you can talk in the live chat or in the Discord chat, and we'll be sure to have a fun conversation about that. But the show for now is done. So thanks for watching and coming by to the live stream.
Yay. You have to leave the yay in.
I might, actually. Like last time.